Jack stood in the middle of his new apartment, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and mismatched furniture. At 20 years old, this was his first place away from the dorms, and though small, it felt like freedom. He walked to the window and pushed it open, letting in the warm September air. The apartment complex was built in a U-shape around a small courtyard, and from his second-floor bedroom, he could see directly into several other units. As the sun began to set, lights flickered on in the apartments across the way. Jack noticed movement in the window directly opposite his. A woman moved about in what looked like a living room filled with art and colorful furniture. She was older than him, maybe mid-20s, with light brown hair pulled back in a messy bun. She wore paint-splattered overalls over a white t-shirt as she arranged things on a large desk by the window. Jack meant to look away, he really did. But something about the woman caught his attention. She moved with confidence, completely at ease in her space. As he watched, she turned on music. He couldn't hear it, but he could see her start to sway to a beat, brushing her hair away from her face as she sorted through papers on her desk. I should close my curtains, Jack thought, but he didn't have curtains yet. That was still on his to-buy list, along with a proper set of dishes and more than one towel. He returned to unpacking, occasionally glancing across at the woman's apartment. She had set up at her desk now, working on something he couldn't quite make out. Every few minutes, she would stand up, step back, and look at her work with her head tilted to the side. Later that night, as Jack lay in bed trying to sleep in the unfamiliar space, he noticed the light was still on across the way. The woman had moved to her couch now, reading a book with her legs tucked under her. She looked peaceful, completely unaware that anyone could see her. "Tomorrow I'll buy curtains," Jack promised himself, "for both of us." But the next day came and went, filled with classes and a shift at the campus bookstore, and curtains somehow never made it to the top of his list. And the day after that, he found himself once again drawn to his window, watching as the woman, he wondered what her name was, danced around her apartment while cooking dinner. It became a strange sort of routine over the next few days. Jack would come home, and almost without thinking, he would glance across the courtyard to see what his neighbor was doing. He learned things about her. She worked from home most days, she liked to dance when she thought no one was watching, and she had a habit of talking to herself while she worked. One evening, a week after moving in, Jack sat at his desk trying to focus on an assignment. The words on his laptop blurred as fatigue set in. He looked up, seeking a distraction, and there she was. Tonight she had set up an easel near the window and was painting, her brush moving in confident strokes. She had changed into loose-fitting pants and a tank top, and her hair was down now, falling past her shoulders. Jack told himself this wasn't weird. Their windows faced each other. She never closed her curtains either. If she wanted privacy, surely she would cover her windows, right? Still, a voice in the back of his mind whispered that this wasn't normal. He shouldn't know that she always made tea around 10 p.m., or that she had a collection of plants she watered every other day, or that when she got a phone call, she paced in circles while talking. He didn't even know her name. But in a strange way, he felt connected to her. This creative, independent woman who lived in her own world just 30 feet across from his. And tomorrow, he promised himself again, he would definitely buy curtains. 2 weeks passed, and Jack still hadn't bought curtains. His routine now included regular glances across the courtyard, watching the woman as she moved through her daily life. He knew he should stop, but there was something peaceful about seeing her in her element, so different from the chaos of his own college life. He learned her schedule by heart. She woke up early, usually around 6, and did yoga in her living room. She worked at her desk from 9 until noon, then took a break for lunch. Afternoons varied. Sometimes she went out, other times she painted or worked on crafts. Evenings were for cooking, reading, or occasionally having a friend over. Jack started to plan his own day around her schedule. He would study at his desk in the morning so he could watch her work across the way. When she left her apartment, he felt a strange disappointment, wondering where she went and with whom. One Tuesday evening, as rain tapped against his window, Jack noticed a man in her apartment. The stranger was tall with a beard, and he moved around her space with the familiarity of someone who had been there before. Jack felt an unexpected twinge in his chest as he watched them laugh together. When they kissed, he finally turned away, feeling like he had crossed a line he hadn't even realized was there. "This is stupid," he muttered to himself. "I don't even know her." The next day, Jack forced himself not to look out his window. He kept his back to it as he studied, ignoring the urge to turn around. But by evening, his resolve had weakened. He glanced across the courtyard just as the woman was hanging up what looked like small paintings to dry. No sign of the man from yesterday. Jack grabbed his jacket and headed out. He needed fresh air and to stop acting like a creep. As he walked down the stairs to the courtyard, he almost ran into someone coming in the main entrance. He looked up to apologize and froze. It was her, his neighbor. Up close, she was even prettier than he'd thought. Her eyes were a warm brown, and she had a small silver nose ring he hadn't been able to see from across the courtyard. "Sorry," Jack managed to say, his voice cracking slightly. "I wasn't looking where I was going." She smiled. "No problem. You're in 2B, right? Across from me?" Jack's heart jumped to his throat. Yeah, how did you know?" "I've seen you at your window a few times." Her voice was casual, but her eyes held his for a second too long. "I'm Emma, by the way." "Jack," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. She knew. She had seen him watching. His face burned with shame. "Well, nice to finally meet you, Jack," Emma said. Then she continued up the stairs, leaving him standing there, mortified. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. He kept replaying their brief interaction, wondering exactly how much she had noticed. Did she think he was a creep? A stalker? Just a harmless neighbor? The next morning, he forced himself to leave for class without looking across the courtyard. But when he returned in the afternoon, something was different. Emma was at her window, looking directly at his apartment, and when she saw him enter his room, she waved. Confused, Jack hesitantly waved back. Emma smiled, then held up a piece of paper with large letters that read, "You should buiurteins." Jack's embarrassment was so complete, he thought he might actually die right there. But then Emma flipped the paper over, and it read, "Or at least wave hello." She was laughing now, not unkindly, but definitely at him. And strangely, Jack found himself laughing too, his embarrassment mixing with relief. She knew he had been watching, and she wasn't calling the police or the landlord. She was teasing him. Maybe this odd, one-sided relationship wasn't as one-sided as he'd thought, and maybe it wasn't as creepy as he feared, though he definitely needed to buy those curtains now, tomorrow, for sure. The next morning, Jack woke up to find a small note slipped under his door. The handwriting was neat and slightly artistic, with little flourishes on the letters. "If you're free this evening, come over for coffee, or tea, or whatever you drink. 6 p.m. Apartment 2A, Emma." Jack read the note 5 times, his heart beating faster each time. She was inviting him over. Was this a trap? Was she going to tell him off properly? Or did she actually want to get to know him? He spent the day in a fog, barely hearing his professors or the jokes his friends made at lunch. By the time he returned to his apartment, he had changed his mind a dozen times about whether to go. But at 5:55 p.m., he found himself standing in front of her door, wearing his cleanest jeans and a shirt he had ironed for the first time in months. He knocked softly, then a bit harder when there was no answer. The door opened, and Emma stood there in paint-splattered jeans and a loose green sweater, her hair piled on top of her head. "You came," she said, smiling. "Come in. I was just finishing something up." Jack stepped into her apartment, feeling like he was entering a familiar but entirely new world. He had seen this place so many times from across the way, but being inside was different. The colors were brighter, the space smaller than it had seemed. It smelled like paint and coffee and something floral. "So," Emma said, gesturing for him to sit on the couch, "I guess we should talk about the elephant in the room." Jack's face flushed. "I'm really sorry about watching you. I know it's weird and creepy and—" "I've been watching you too," Emma interrupted. "What?" Jack stared at her. Emma laughed. "Not as much as you've been watching me, I'm pretty sure. But yes, I noticed you right after you moved in. It's hard not to look when our windows are right across from each other. But you never seem to—" Jack trailed off, not sure how to finish. "I'm better at being subtle," Emma said, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "I was curious about the young guy who moved in. I saw you studying late at night, talking on the phone, doing push-ups when you thought no one was looking. Jack groaned, covering his face with his hands. This is so embarrassing. It's a little embarrassing, Emma agreed, sitting next to him and handing him a mug. But also kind of interesting, don't you think? We've been silently observing each other's lives without ever speaking. So you're not mad? Jack asked cautiously. I would have been, if it felt threatening, Emma said, her voice more serious now. But it didn't. It just felt like curiosity. Though I did wonder if you'd ever actually introduce yourself, or if I'd have to make the first move. I kept telling myself I would buy curtains, Jack admitted. But you never did. No, I never did. They fell silent, sipping their coffee. Jack noticed small details of her apartment he couldn't see from his window, the titles of books on her shelf, the signatures on her paintings, the small cat figurines lined up on a windowsill. So what do you do? Jack asked finally. I mean, I've seen you painting, but I'm a graphic designer, Emma said. I work from home most days, and I paint for fun. What about you? Besides being a professional peeping Tom, her eyes twinkled as she teased him. I'm studying engineering, Jack said, second year. This is my first apartment off campus. I know, Emma said. I saw all your boxes when you moved in. Jack laughed, feeling some of his nervousness fade. This is so weird. Completely weird, Emma agreed. But kind of nice too, right? To finally meet? Jack nodded. For all his watching, he realized he knew almost nothing about her. The real Emma was more vivid, more present than the silent figure he had observed. Her laugh was louder, her movements more defined, her eyes more expressive. So, Emma said, now that we've finally met properly, tell me something I couldn't learn from just watching you through a window. And surprisingly easily, Jack began to talk. Coffee with Emma turned into dinner. She ordered pizza when they realized they had been talking for hours, and Jack had been too nervous to eat before coming over. They sat cross-legged on her living room floor, paper plates balanced on their knees, as Jack told her about growing up in a small town and Emma shared stories about her 3 years working at an advertising agency before going freelance. So that's why you can afford such a nice apartment, Jack said, looking around at her tasteful furniture. Meanwhile, half my stuff is from the dorm dumpster at the end of last year. Emma laughed. I saw you carrying in that desk. I was wondering if it would hold up. It's only collapsed twice, Jack said, grinning. It was nearly midnight when Jack finally stood to leave. He felt oddly reluctant, like leaving her apartment meant breaking some kind of spell. This was nice, Emma said, walking him to the door. We should do it again. Maybe next time you can invite me to your place, and I can see how it looks from the inside instead of through the window. It's a mess, Jack warned, and much smaller than yours. I don't mind, Emma said. As Jack walked across the courtyard to his building, he looked up and saw both their apartments, windows lit and facing each other. It felt different now, knowing she had been watching him too. Over the next few weeks, they fell into a new routine. Some evenings he would go to her place, other times she would come to his. They would cook together or watch movies or just talk. Jack helped Emma move a bookshelf, and she helped him study for a difficult engineering exam by quizzing him. They still watched each other across the courtyard, but now they would wave or hold up notes or make funny faces. One night, they sat on Jack's small balcony, sharing a bottle of wine. The air was getting cooler as fall deepened, and Emma had brought a blanket that they draped over their legs. I still can't believe this is how we met, Emma said, looking across at her own apartment. Me catching you spying on me. I wasn't spying, Jack protested. I was observing. Mum. Emma nudged him with her elbow. So have you told your friends about me? Jack paused. He had mentioned Emma to his roommate from last year, who had just laughed and said, Dude, she's way out of your league. And he wasn't wrong. Emma was beautiful, successful, mature. Jack still couldn't quite believe she wanted to spend time with him. Not really, he admitted. Have you told your friends about me? A couple, Emma said. My friend Lily thinks it's cute. Cute? Jack frowned. Like I'm a puppy or something. Emma turned to look at him. No, like us. She thinks it's cute how we met. So there's an us? Jack asked before he could stop himself. Emma was quiet for a moment. I don't know. Is there? The air between them seemed to thicken. Jack could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. Emma was looking at him with those bright, serious eyes waiting for an answer. He was suddenly very aware of how close they were sitting, their shoulders touching under the blanket. "I'd like there to be," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma smiled, a slow smile that lit up her whole face. "Me too." She leaned in, and Jack held his breath as her lips met his. The kiss was soft, a gentle question. When they pulled apart, Jack felt dizzy. "You know," Emma said, her voice teasing but with something deeper underneath, "if you had just bought curtains like you kept promising yourself, none of this would have happened." Jack laughed, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. "I think I'm glad I never got around to it." "Me too," Emma said and kissed him again, more deeply this time, as the night wrapped around them like the blanket they shared. As November turned cold, Jack and Emma's relationship grew warmer. They started spending most evenings together, studying or working side by side. Jack loved watching Emma design logos or create illustrations on her tablet, her face serious with concentration. Emma enjoyed quizzing Jack on his engineering problems, impressed by how quickly his mind worked through complex equations. But as they grew closer, small doubts began to creep into Jack's mind. One evening, Emma invited him to a gallery opening where one of her paintings was being shown. Jack put on his only nice shirt and a borrowed tie, feeling out of place among the artists and professionals who greeted Emma with hugs and air kisses. "This is Jack," Emma would say, her hand warm on his back, and their eyes would flicker over him, measuring, assessing. She never introduced him as her boyfriend, and he didn't know if that was because he wasn't, or because she was embarrassed by him. At the gallery, a tall man with gray at his temples put his hand on Emma's shoulder. "Emma, your work is stunning as always." "David. Thank you for coming." Emma smiled warmly. "This is Jack." "Jack, this is David, my former boss at the agency." David shook Jack's hand with a firm grip. "Nice to meet you. How do you know our talented Emma?" "We're neighbors," Jack said because it was easier than explaining. "And you are?" David prompted. "A student," Jack replied, feeling his cheeks warm. "Engineering." "Ah, still in school," David nodded, his interest clearly fading. He turned back to Emma, launching into a story about someone they both knew. Jack drifted away, pretending to study a nearby painting. He caught fragments of their conversation, job offers, clients, names of people and places he didn't know. Emma's world. A world that had existed long before he looked across the courtyard and saw her dancing. Later that night, as they walked back to their apartment building, Emma noticed his silence. "Are you okay?" she asked, linking her arm through his. "You got quiet." "I'm fine," Jack said, "just feeling a bit out of place, I guess." Emma stopped walking, turning to face him. "Why?" Jack shrugged, not meeting her eyes. "Everyone there was so." He gestured vaguely. "Adult, successful. Like you." "And you think you're not?" Emma asked softly. "I'm still in school. I live in a tiny apartment with furniture from the dumpster. I can barely afford to take you out to dinner." The words came out more bitter than he intended. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Do you really think I care about any of that?" she asked. "You should," Jack said. "You deserve someone who can match you, who fits into your world." "My world?" Emma laughed. "Jack, before I met you, my world was working too much, occasional drinks with colleagues, and falling asleep watching movies alone. You think those people tonight are my friends? They're connections. Network. It's not the same thing." Jack didn't know what to say. Emma sighed, dropping her hands. "Look, I know there's an age gap. I know we're at different places in our lives. But when I'm with you," she paused, searching for words, "it's like everything is brighter, more interesting. You see things differently than anyone else I know." "Because I'm young and naive?" Jack asked, only half joking. "Because you're you," Emma said simply. "And I'm falling in love with you. Not with what you do, or how much money you make, or who you know. Just you." The words hung in the cold night air between them. Jack felt them settle into his chest, warming him from the inside. "You're falling in love with me?" he repeated, hardly believing it. Emma nodded, suddenly looking vulnerable. "Is that okay?" Jack pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "It's more than okay, because I'm already in love with you." When they kissed this time, it felt different. Like a promise. Like a beginning. And as they walked the rest of the way home, their hands linked tightly together, Jack realized that maybe it didn't matter that they were at different places in life. What mattered was that they were walking in the same direction. December brought snow, finals for Jack, and a big project deadline for Emma. They saw less of each other during those busy weeks, often just waving across the courtyard or sharing quick meals before returning to their work. But on the last day of finals, Jack knocked on Emma's door with a bottle of champagne and 2 plastic cups. "We made it," he announced when she opened the door. "Time to celebrate." Emma smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She let him in, and Jack noticed right away that something was wrong. Her usually tidy apartment was messier than he'd ever seen it, with papers spread across her desk and coffee cups piled in the sink. "Is everything okay?" Jack asked, setting down the champagne. Emma sat on the couch, pulling her knees up to her chest. "I got a job offer today." "That's great," Jack said, then paused when he saw her expression. "Isn't it?" "It's in Chicago," Emma said quietly. "A senior design position at a big agency. The kind of opportunity I've been working toward for years." "Oh." Jack felt like all the air had left his lungs. "When would you start?" "February 1st. Emma looked up at him. "That's only 6 weeks away." Jack sat down beside her, trying to process what this meant. Chicago was hundreds of miles away. They had only been together for a few months, but the thought of not seeing her every day made his chest hurt. "Did you take it?" he asked, dreading the answer. "I told them I needed a few days to think about it." Emma reached for his hand. "Jack, this is a really big deal for my career." "I know," he said because he did. Emma was brilliant at what she did. She deserved this opportunity. "You should take it." "Just like that?" Emma looked surprised. "You don't want to talk about it more?" "What's there to talk about?" Jack tried to keep his voice steady. "I can't ask you to stay here for me." "Why not?" Emma challenged. "If you asked me to stay, I would at least consider it." "Because I love you," Jack said simply. "And loving someone means wanting what's best for them, even when it hurts." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "But what about us?" Jack hadn't allowed himself to think that far ahead. "I don't know. Long distance." Emma sighed. "I've done long distance before. It never works." "We could be different," Jack said, not believing in himself. They sat in silence for a while, both lost in thought. Finally, Emma spoke. "What if you came with me?" Jack blinked. "To Chicago? Why not?" Emma turned to face him. "You could transfer schools, or take a semester off, or just work for a while." "I can't just drop everything," Jack said, though a part of him wanted to say yes immediately. "Why not?" Emma pressed. "What's keeping you here, really?" Jack tried to find a good answer but couldn't. His friends, he had some, but none he couldn't keep in touch with online. His classes? There were engineering schools in Chicago. His family? They lived 3 states away anyway. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's just a big step. Bigger than falling in love with your nosy neighbor." Emma smiled a little. Jack laughed despite himself. "Good point." Emma took his hands. "Look, I'm not saying you have to decide right now, but think about it, okay? Because I love you, Jack, and I don't want to lose this, us, when we've only just found it." Jack pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. 6 weeks suddenly seemed like no time at all. "I'll think about it," he promised, "and whatever happens, we'll figure it out." That night, they didn't open the champagne. Instead, they lay together on Emma's bed, talking about Chicago, the neighborhoods, the museums, the lake. As Emma drifted off to sleep beside him, Jack stayed awake, staring at the ceiling. He tried to imagine waking up each morning and not seeing her window across the courtyard. He tried to imagine her not being there to laugh at his jokes or challenge his ideas or kiss him goodnight. And suddenly, the decision didn't seem so difficult after all. The next morning, Jack woke up before Emma. He slipped out of bed quietly and went to the window. The sun was just rising, painting the courtyard with golden light. He looked across at his own apartment, at the window where he had first seen Emma dancing. How different things were now, just 3 months later. He made coffee and brought a cup to Emma, who was still curled up in bed. She smiled sleepily as she took it, scooting over to make room for him beside her. "I've been thinking," Jack said, sitting down. "About Chicago." Emma sat up straighter, suddenly wide awake. "And I want to come with you," Jack said. I already looked into it last night while you were sleeping. There's a good engineering program at Illinois Tech. I can apply for a transfer for next fall. Until then, I can find a job, maybe take some online classes. Emma's eyes went wide. Are you serious? Completely, Jack said. I love you, Emma. And I don't want to find out if long distance works or not, because I don't want to be distant from you at all. Emma put down her coffee and threw her arms around him. Are you sure? It's a big decision. I've never been more sure about anything, Jack said, and he meant it. The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of planning and packing. Jack talked to his parents, who were surprised but supportive. He applied for a transfer to Illinois Tech for the fall semester and found a part-time job at a coffee shop in Chicago that would start in February. Emma signed a lease on a small 2-bedroom apartment near her new office, with space for both of them to work. On their last night in their old apartments, they stood at Emma's window, looking across at Jack's now empty unit. His furniture had been sold or given away, his books and clothes packed into boxes in Emma's living room, ready for the moving truck tomorrow. Remember when you used to watch me from over there? Emma asked, leaning back against his chest. How could I forget? Jack said. I was so creepy. You were curious, Emma corrected him, and I'm glad you were. Otherwise, we might never have met. We would have, Jack said confidently. Maybe not the same way, but we would have. I believe that. Emma turned in his arms to face him. How can you be so sure? Because some things are just meant to happen, Jack said. Like me seeing you dance that first night, like you catching me watching. Like us falling in love. Like us moving to Chicago together, Emma asked. Exactly, Jack said, though I still can't believe we're really doing this. Having second thoughts? Emma asked, a touch of worry in her voice. Not even for a second, Jack assured her. I'm excited. A new city, a new start. Together. That night, they slept on a mattress on Emma's floor, surrounded by boxes. In the morning, they would load the moving truck and drive to Chicago, to their new home. As Jack drifted off to sleep, Emma's head on his chest, he thought about how much had changed since that September evening when he had first looked out his window. He had been just a boy then, watching a beautiful stranger from afar. Now he was moving across the country with the woman he loved. All because he had been curious, and she had caught him looking. 6 months ago, Jack had moved into that apartment hoping to find independence. Instead, he had found Emma. And somehow, loving her and being loved by her had made him more himself than he had ever been before. As Jack finally fell asleep, he realized that for all his watching of Emma across the courtyard, he had never really seen her until she saw him too. And in being truly seen by her, he had found not just love, but the courage to leap into an unknown future, trusting that they would face it together. Sometimes the most meaningful connections begin with a curious glance, and sometimes being caught is the luckiest thing that can happen to you.